Are you a safe driver? I feel like most people, your gut reply is yes. Even though people may believe they're good drivers, they sometimes use their cell phones while driving. And the data show that this distraction can be deadly, but the question remains, why does using a cell phone impair driving? Psychologists don't answer questions like this one based on intuition, beliefs, or even opinions. Instead, because psychology is a science, psychologists use specific goals and methods to learn about mental activity, behavior, and the brain processes that underlie them. Science has 4 goals: description, prediction, control, and explanation. So the goals of psychological science are to describe what a particular phenomenon is, predict when it will occur, control what causes it to occur, and explain why it occurs. For example, consider the idea that using a cell phone interferes with driving. To understand how this interference happens, psychologists need to address each of the 4 goals of psychology. And different studies might examine any of these goals to better understand how cell phones affect driving. First, psychologists describe the phenomenon that is happening. To pose a question that requires description, researchers might ask, how many people use their cell phones while driving? In addition, the researchers might describe whether people talk or text on the phone more while driving. Second, psychologists predict when the phenomenon they have described happens. For example, they might examine how often using a cell phone is related to collisions. In this case, investigating an association between using a cell phone and crashing helps researchers predict that future cell phone use while driving might be associated with more crashes. Third, psychologists may pursue the goal of control by changing one factor to influence another. For example, how do we know that using the cell phone is what negatively affects driving? Perhaps some other factor, such as the driver's personality, causes this outcome. After all, people who are more likely to take risks might drive dangerously, and they might be inclined to use cell phones more when driving. Controlling the conditions of their studies makes it possible for researchers to know that using the cell phone and not some other factor is responsible for the effects. Finally, psychologists try to explain a phenomenon. In this case, researchers will have described and predicted cell phone use while driving, and they will have controlled the situation in which cell phone use leads to poor driving. Various additional studies are likely to be conducted to examine what aspects of cell phone use are responsible for its effects on driving. Is it because people use their hands to hold the phone, or that they take their eyes off the road to dial or to text, or that using the phone interferes with their mental ability to focus on driving? Careful research using the scientific method lets psychologists understand many aspects of using a cell phone while driving. This research lets psychologists develop good scientific explanations, or theories, for the behavior and its effects. Researchers might further examine why people continue to use their cell phones while driving, despite the danger of doing so. Ultimately, the knowledge from psychological research may help scientists, technology developers, and policymakers create strategies to reduce this dangerous behavior. Because they are scientists, psychologists base their beliefs about behavior and mental processes on observing the world and measuring various aspects of it. This approach is called empiricism. To be confident about the conclusions drawn from their observations, psychologists conduct empirical research using the scientific method. There are 3 aspects of the scientific method. First, the scientific method requires that psychologists follow several carefully planned, systematic steps. Second, the processes that psychologists use in the scientific method must be objective, that is, free from bias. Third, the procedures must be reproducible. In other words, if other psychologists repeat the same procedures with similar research participants, they would expect to obtain the same results. This idea is called replication. Replication is an important part of the scientific method. It means that research is always continuing and getting additional results from scientific studies, and that increases our confidence in the findings. The more researchers follow the scientific method, the more we can be confident that their empirical research results provide a good understanding of mental activity and behavior. The process of the scientific method includes the continuous cycle of the 5 steps shown here. To explore these steps, imagine that you're doing research on using a cell phone while driving. Psychologists study research questions they find interesting. For example, when they see a person behaving in a puzzling way, they may seek to understand that behavior. Think of using a cell phone while driving as a puzzling behavior. Research questions related to this particular puzzling behavior would revolve around why using a cell phone while driving is dangerous. To understand a complex behavior, psychologists often start with a theory based on existing evidence. A theory is an explanation or a model of how some mental process or behavior occurs. The theory consists of interconnected ideas or concepts that are used to explain prior research findings and to make predictions about future events. Your theory might involve various mechanisms to explain the behavior, such as distracted driving is a major cause of car crashes. Formulating a theory is the first step in the scientific method. In formulating a theory, you need to learn about prior research related to the topic. As soon as possible, you should perform a literature review. A literature review explores the scientific articles related to your theory. There are many resources available to assist with literature reviews, including scientific research databases such as PsycInfo, Google Scholar, PubMed, and even EBSCOsearch. You can search these databases by keywords such as distraction and driving, or you might think of how people can be distracted while driving, and then you would search for cell phones and crashes. The results of your searches will reveal if and how other scientists have been testing the same idea or similar ones. For example, psychologists from various subfields may have investigated in different ways the topic of how using a cell phone disrupts driving. These researchers' findings may help you redefine your theory, and they may guide the direction of your research. A clearly stated theory is important because it's the basis for the next step of the scientific method, developing a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a specific, testable prediction about the theory. Any one theory is usually tested by several separate hypotheses. Each hypothesis tests a different aspect of the theory by targeting one of the goals of science: description, prediction, control, and explanation. For example, a hypothesis that is appropriate for your theory might have the goal of explaining why people drive worse when using a cell phone. A good hypothesis with this goal might be: research participants holding a conversation on a cell phone, whether handheld or hands-free, during a driving simulation task will perform more poorly than participants not holding a conversation on a cell phone. Now you move to the third step in the scientific method, testing the hypothesis. The three main types of research methods you can use to test your research question are descriptive, correlational, and experimental. And you're going to learn about all three of these research methods later on in this unit. Which research method you use depends on the goal of your research and the hypothesis you have stated. What method you use also depends on how much control you need over manipulating and measuring factors in the study. A variable is something in the world that can vary and that the researcher can manipulate or change, measure, or both. In a study of cell phone use and driving ability, some of the variables would be under the researcher's control, such as whether the people in the study held the phone or used the hands-free phone. Other variables are those that the researcher measures, such as driving performance. For your research, because the goal is explanation and the hypothesis pertains to an explanation of how cell phone use interferes with driving, you must use an experimental method. In an experiment, you control the variables you're manipulating to investigate whether there is a cause-effect relationship between the variables. To test the hypothesis, research participants holding a conversation on a cell phone during a driving simulation task will perform more poorly than participants not holding a conversation. You might create an experiment where some of the participants might just drive. Others would drive while carrying on a conversation on a cell phone. And to rule out the possibility that it's not just simply holding the phone, you might include conditions in which people are talking while holding a cell phone and where they're talking using a hands-free cell phone. You could then observe people's driving in the simulator in terms of how quickly they drive, how carefully they drive, how many crashes they have, and so on. In step 4 of the scientific method, you analyze the data from your research to see whether your hypothesis is supported. First, you summarize the raw data. Then you determine whether differences really exist between the sets of summarized data. Both of these forms of data analysis will be described later. In the current example, you could summarize the data by comparing the number of crashes people had when driving while they were either holding a cell phone conversation handheld or hands-free or not using a cell phone. Then you would decide whether any differences between those conditions were meaningful or whether they happened by chance. That is, you would determine whether you found a significant effect. If you have a significant effect, you can then examine whether your findings would be the same if you studied other groups of people. That is, you can consider whether your findings apply to people in general. Lastly, you must report your research results. One way this can happen is at a scientific conference where attendees present their findings at talk or poster sessions. Another way of reporting research results is to publish them in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Published articles are more thorough means of presenting findings because they include all the background for the research, the full methodology for how the question was studied, the complete data analyses, and a discussion of what the results mean in relation to other research on the topic. As a part of the cycle of the scientific method, you or other researchers determine what issues related to the topic need additional investigation. Remember, no single study definitively answers any research question. A study shows only what happened in a particular set of circumstances. As a result, psychologists never say they have proved a theory. And as mentioned in a previous screencast, this is why scientists avoid the term fact. However, you generally can feel more confident about research findings when two things have happened. First, the researchers have followed the scientific method in performing a particular study. And second, that the study and its outcomes have been replicated by the same researchers or others. When the results from two or more studies are the same, or at least support the same conclusion, the findings are more likely to be trustworthy. In addition, with each new study that explores a related but slightly different aspect of the topic, more information becomes available. And in psychology, the accumulated findings add to the understanding of mental activity and behavior.